In this tutorial, we are going to discuss empty HTML tags. This might sound like a nothing topic, but it is actually very interesting. Empty tags have many uses and funny quirks that you should know about it if you're working knee-deep in HTML. This is also very much linked with CSS and JavaScript when we want to handle certain spaces or certain kind of code. We basically use empty tags there as well. Let's define what empty tags are and answer some tricky questions on this often avoided topic. HTML elements that do not have closing tags such as break and another one is HR, they are basically called empty tags. Similarly, there is another one called image. So that is used to call an image in the web page are considered empty tags or void tags or self-closing tag as they cannot contain other elements or contents. So possibly if you are going for an interview of a junior web developer, you possibly be asked this kind of questions. May not be asked about what is empty tag, maybe self-closing tags or void tags. So you need to learn these terminologies so that you are familiar with what they are, and when somebody asks you a question, or even if you are having a technical discussion with somebody, you would understand what self-closing tags are. So they cannot contain other elements or contents. So container tags that have nothing inside them, such as an empty div. This is called empty container tag as well. Container tags are widely used in HTML. We'll be learning them in another tutorial and talking about them in detail. And they are very, very useful in real life web development. So there are two types of container tags. One is div and the other very famous is span. So they can also be used as an empty tag because there's nothing in there. But if we put some space there like that, now it is not an empty tag. It won't be considered as an empty tag. Or if we put anything in between, that won't be considered as an empty tag. In HTML, container elements such as divs or spans have an opening tag, which you have seen, and a closing tag as well. And they are used to contain other elements or contents. Empty tags, also called self-closing tags such as BR or HR or image, have no closing tags and they cannot contain other elements. So there are roughly 15 empty tags. These are also known as self-closing or void tags because they do not have any corresponding closing tags and they cannot contain other elements. Some common example you have already seen. There are a few other which we'll be discussing shortly. According to the W3C HTML5 specs, closing slashes for empty tags are optional. Closing slashes such as you can use this horizontal just HR there, or you can use HR like that and it will be perfectly okay, or you can use also HR and with no spaces and that would be absolutely fine as well. So all these three are basically void self-closing tags. For HTML and XML documents with a MIME type of application XML, so something like application XML, all empty tags must have a closing slash. For example, break like that, a horizontal rule like that, or break like that. So if you are using XML, then it is must to have it, but for HTML5 it is optional. As my personal preference with HTML5 is to always use closing slashes because it makes your markup consistent, and then you don't have to be worried about when you're coding for XML or other strict applications. Adding or closing tag to an empty tag such as break or like for example, if I just put this one, a closing tag for break is this, and now this is invalid HTML. In HTML5, you can optionally indicate that a tag is self-closing by adding a trailing slash, which is this one, but you can't use the closing tag for an empty tag. So that's invalid HTML. In XML or XHTML or XML document, all empty tags must have a closing slash to be valid. So as I said before, use the trailing slash so that your code is always safe in XHTML or XML. A div or any container element is considered empty if it does not contain any other elements, text or white spaces such as spaces or links breaks, line breaks and kind of stuff. HTML comments, processing instructions, and CSS generated content with the colon before or colon after pseudo classes do not affect whether element is empty or not. Empty divs or any other container element are only considered bad if they serve no purpose. So empty divs have many uses such as spacer elements, design elements, and placeholders for JavaScript actions. Empty tags are valid HTML, but they do add to page weight and may cause some accessibility issues. Developers use them often to help them with coding in JavaScript or put some styling with CSS. So if they are not used anywhere, yes, they are bad, but if they are used, it's perfectly okay. Div tag does not require any contents. Empty divs are valid HTML and they are useful for many things such as spacer elements as we discussed before, or design elements or placeholders for JavaScript actions. So empty divs are not generally bad for accessibility because they are semantically empty. However, if you are using a div for a particular function that needs to be accessible, for example, for a screen reader, you can mark up its purpose with area label, like I will put that area label dash menu button. Now that is perfectly okay. For more detail, please see our tutorial about area labels, and when we'll be talking about that in detail. To make an empty div take up spaces, give it a height or minimum height in CSS. If the div is floating, you will also need to add a width or minimum width, because floating element automatically shrink to the size of their floated contents, and an empty div contains nothing, so it won't take any space width or height wise. So what we have to do is in CSS we have to set a minimum height and minimum width for that container to take some space. You can select empty tags in CSS with the :empty pseudo class. Tags are only empty if they contain no white spaces or no other element, as I explained before. HTML comments, processing instructions, and CSS generated contents with the :before and :after pseudo classes do not affect whether an element is empty. So a comment like that, where I put a comment in the, say if I create another div, so that's my comment, and it won't be visible anywhere, as you know. Also, this div is still considered as empty div because there are no white spaces or anything there. Non-empty divs, example for non-empty divs. So if I put a div here, and now that's not an empty div. or if I put a div there and put comments there, and now because there are empty spaces there and an extra line, so that will not be considered as an empty div. These are the example, or if I just put another example of non-empty div is div, and if I put them on a separate line, even though there's no spaces between these two lines, are still not empty divs, so they are not an example of empty divs. So examples of empty tags, and up to here, and then if I put tags, and it goes up to here. So this is our empty example of our empty tag. In JavaScript, I'm just typing the code over here. Basically, we'll have a script and closing script, and within that we basically type in some JavaScript code. So let's say const L is equal to, we need to select the element first, so we need to find that element document dot get element by ID, or get element by ID, or we can use query selector. Either double quote or single quote. Element ID, and then basically L dot child nodes dot length should be equal to 0, and that basically will tell you that if the node is if that node is empty. So we check using JavaScript, we check the divs and use the child nodes property. This property returns a node list. If the elements children including text nodes, comments and other elements return value of 0, mean the div is empty. Self-closing tags such as pr or image are always empty. So you can test it on them if your code is working, and if it is working, then you can work out on your divs and find out if they are empty or not. If you are writing a code and you want to make sure that div is empty, then you can follow up with the same code, and then you can say L dot inner HTML equal to the quotes and semicolon. Make sure that you don't put any space in between these quotes, so single quotes or double quotes. JavaScript doesn't mind really, so this way you can empty a node over there. By default, an empty span will not display. The 4 ways to make it visible are to add dimensions such as width or minimum width, and a height or minimum height. Give it some padding, add a border, or place something inside it such as non-breaking spaces like and BSP, or colon before or after content. So something like that will basically add a style to an empty span. Custom HTML elements must always contain a hyphen. So you can, in HTML, you can create custom HTML tags, which we'll talk about in detail in another tutorial. So custom element could be, so if I am typing custom element, so my element, so custom element can also have an empty, they can be defined just like div or span, so they can also be an empty tag or void tag. Image is empty tag because all you do is you define the source of it. Image is cat.jpg, and that's pretty much it. So you will have cat image, and that cat image basically this image will only have this, they have no closing tag, or so they are also considered empty tag. Reload page, and there you go. Yes, break is an empty tag because it does not have a closing tag. Input is another one. So input tag, which is used in forms, so input text or input other kind of, there are many types of inputs. We'll discuss that in future tutorials. So there is a lot to know about empty HTML tags. Self-closing tags are empty, and so are container tags that have nothing inside them. Both type of empty tags have many uses and quirks that you should know about. So that's pretty much it about empty tags. I'll see you in next lecture.